There are so many translations to choose from. How do I know which one to pick? Furthermore, how do I know that what's in any of these translations is accurate based on what was originally written? Maybe you've asked yourself these or similar questions. If you have, stay tuned and hopefully we can make sense of all this. If this is your first time here, please make sure you hit the subscribe button so that you never miss a new video or interview that we have. And make sure to click the bell. Our goal is to help you enter into a confirmed, confident, and eternal relationship with the source of all life and purpose. So this is not going to be an exhaustive course on canonization and on how the Bible came to be, but I'm going to give you 4 things that you need to know about the canon of Scripture and the debate surrounding the date, origin, and canon of Scripture. The debate surrounding the date, origin, and nature of how the books within the Bible became canonized has raged for centuries. Klein writes, in the middle of the 2nd century, the first major impetus to the explicit discussion of a Christian canon came from the heretic Marcion. Marcion believed that Jesus and the God of the Old Testament were opposites, and that anything in Christian writings that smacked of Judaism ought to be expunged. Now, there are several issues with Marcionism that we won't get into in this video, but very briefly, I'll just say that Jesus affirmed the Old Testament, and that's a great reason not to expunge it. So with regards to the canon, first, why is a canon of multiple texts even necessary, and what can we learn just from the fact that multiple documents exist that now comprise the canon of Scripture? Kaiser and Silver write, the very idea of a canon implies a standard or an authoritative measuring device by which a collection of books is recognized as the norm for the community. What results from establishing that norm is that we get the benefit of having a better understanding of who and how God is. They go on to write, thus, while the individual parts of the canon are individually valuable, only as the entire corpus is viewed as a whole can the whole mind of God be finally declared on any topic that several of the books may address. Now, before we even get into dating or codifying the canon, some may ask, why would God work through so many different authors? Why do other religions have one author? Well, that's actually a great gift that God gives us, especially with regards to a Christian worldview. It helps us to affirm the validity of what was written. How, you ask? Well, if you have a choice between single attestation and multiple attestation, which would you choose? In other words, is something more trustworthy if one person says they saw some person commit a crime, or if 40 people say, I saw that guy over there do it? Multiple attestation, when available, is always a better source for validating the account that is in question. But the singular thread that runs through Scripture confirms the divine authorship of the entire corpus of the documents, because when you delve into the undesigned coincidences and how Scripture verifies Scripture, one thing that is certain and one thing that you realize is that this is unfakeable. I don't even know if that's a word. There's no way that this work could be born out of collusion or some purely human mode of authorship. Now, I've done other videos on how we know we can trust the words of the Bible, and specifically those of Jesus, so that's all I'll say on this topic for now. Second, let's talk about several methods for how scholars view canonicity and when to date the canon as complete. If we examine multiple perspectives, that will augment our understanding of how the New Testament came to be canonized. We need to elaborate on the definition, origins, writing, authors, and dating of the canon in order to parse out the objective and subjective date concerning the canonization, specifically of the New Testament. Now, some have chosen to draw a strict distinction between Scripture and canon. For example, A.C. Sundberg drew a sharp distinction between these terms and favored an exclusive definition of the canon. He argued that we cannot speak of the idea of canon until at least the 4th century or later, although Scripture would have existed prior to this time period. Sundberg argues that we must reserve the term canon until the end of the entire process. I'm not so sure about that one. This doesn't seem to be how the early church fathers viewed Scripture, which was long before Sundberg's viewpoint was introduced. Now let's look at some other different models for examining canonicity. First, let's discuss the extrinsic model, and this is something that Sundberg would probably favor, and he would probably be one of the main proponents for this. The extrinsic model asserts that in some way the canon was imposed on the Christian faith, or that factors external to the writing of the Gospels and the letters are what determine a particular work's inclusion in the canon. The intrinsic model asserts that the canon is not something that was created from people or forces external to the text or from Constantine, but developed internally within Christianity. It was an organic process. It was agreed upon long before the 4th century. Now, some of the issues or faulty conclusions drawn from the extrinsic model are that it gives the impression that the canon is a late ecclesiastical creation. The earliest Christians were illiterate and uninterested in books, and that the authors of the New Testament did not conceive of themselves as producing authoritative texts. But see, this is why we need to consider the functional definition of the canon and the ontological definition of the canon in order to provide a fuller assessment of how to view canonicity. See, the functional definition addresses the use or function of the books prior to their official canonization as validation of their canonicity. Kruger writes, the term canon can be employed as soon as a book is regarded as scripture by early Christian communities. Thinking of the canon as what is in essence just the official stapled together set of documents is far too simplistic. With reference to the idea of canon, Childs writes that it can encompass the entire process by which the formation of the church's sacred writings took place. We also need to employ the ontological definition of canon, which goes a step further in proposing that if God inspires a book, then its canonicity can essentially be inferred immediately, regardless of human recognition. Kruger writes, books do not become canonical. They are canonical because they are the books God has given us as a permanent guide for his church. So how the early church codified the books of the New Testament has been questioned, and the extrinsic model, in my opinion, may lead some to falsely believe that some church fathers locked themselves in a room and chose their favorite gospels and letters. Barr writes, Jesus in his teaching is nowhere portrayed as commanding or even sanctioning the production of a written New Testament. Not exactly. The night before he was crucified, while in the presence of his disciples, Jesus says in his priestly prayer, I do not pray for these alone, but also for those who will believe in me through their word. In essence, Jesus co-signs everything that will eventually be written before it's even written. Furthermore, what is sometimes behind the statement that Jesus never told his disciples to write anything down is the idea that since most people were illiterate, that it served no purpose for them to have a written work in the first place.
And yeah, it's very important to note that, like, even in Greco-Roman culture, one of the things they note about Christians is this unique devotion to a textual faith. Like, they have worship practices too, but no other religion used texts the way they did. They didn't gather around and read it. The pagans would have priests that would read maybe a cultic document, but that wasn't in public. That was something for them to read in the temple alone. So this was very distinct about Jews and Christians. So yeah, as far as the book technology question, this is a fascinating thing for people that don't know the history of the book, if you will. I often tell people, if you like books, you should thank a Christian. And that's not because we invented them, right. But largely we're responsible for the fact that you have one. The reason we use books today and we don't use scrolls is because of the way Christianity continued to promote it.
As Kruger himself states, our thesis is a simple one. The New Testament authors, generally speaking, demonstrate awareness that their writings passed down authentic apostolic tradition and therefore bore supreme authority in the life of the church. In other words, their writings were the final writings, and this standard was recognized by all, regardless of if one prefers the extrinsic or intrinsic model. Third, when were the texts which are now canonized in the New Testament seen as authoritative? Now, in thinking about the intrinsic model in comparison to the extrinsic model, the intrinsic model lines up with what occurred historically. Neither the apostles nor the church fathers added to the works that comprised the New Testament. It seems they considered the canon closed long before the end of the 1st century, not the 4th. The entire church, minus a few heretics like Marcion, were unanimous in this agreement. Now, before we proceed with more evidence, a couple of considerations need to be taken into account. One is that when God redeems his people or advances his kingdom in a significant way, there's always new revelation that he provides or that is eventually written down. Think of the Jews being liberated from Egypt and the written words delivered to and through Moses. The Jews were living in expectation of the coming Messiah. And so this being the greatest hope and desire of Israel for the Messiah to come, to reestablish his kingdom on the earth was their hope and our hope. And because of that hope, that actually adds another layer of evidence to this discussion. See, if that is in fact what took place with Jesus' life, ministry, death, and resurrection, what could be more worthy of writing down everything he said, or at least most of it, what he did, where he went, because it has huge impact for them and for all of humanity. In other words, there's an eschatological component that needs to be introduced. There was something final to those who were following Christ about who Christ was and what he did. Nothing could be more worthy of putting pen to papyrus than that. Now, some have objected and said that the eschatological view of favoritism of oral tradition would have dissuaded the writings of new authoritative texts. But Kruger provides a rebuttal. He writes, if apostles were viewed as the mouthpiece of Christ, and it was believed that they wrote down that apostolic message in books, then those books would be received as the very words of Christ himself. Such writings would not have to wait until the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th century ecclesiastical decisions to be viewed as authoritative. Instead, they would be viewed as authoritative from almost the very start. For this reason, a written New Testament was not something the church formally decided to have at some later date, but was instead the natural outworking of the early church's view of the function of the apostles. In other words, the apostles would have viewed and did view their writings both as necessary and as authoritative. Authorship is a fiercely contested aspect of who wrote what book and how it was entered into the canon. Ehrman has stated that there has been a broad consensus among scholars that many of the books of the New Testament were not written by the people whose names are attached to them. Well, not only does Kruger demonstrate how patently false this statement is, but he makes a thorough case for how the New Testament authors viewed their writings as authoritative and even as doctrinal, on par with Old Testament writings. You can think about passages like Galatians 1:1, 1 Thessalonians 2:13, Mark 1:1, John 21:24, and many others as confirmation of this early understanding maintained by the New Testament authors. The extrinsic model dates canonization somewhere in the 4th century. However, if the New Testament authors, early church, and church fathers were already viewing the 27 New Testament books as scripture and equally authoritative with the Old Testament text, our dating of the canon needs to be much earlier. Ferguson notes, it is interesting to note that Tertullian often translates this term with the Latin instrumentum and sometimes testamentum, which were used in the Roman world to refer to written legal documents. Now, one last very important bit of evidence needs to be considered to show that an early canon date is well established. In his work, Against Heresies, Irenaeus quotes from 12 out of 13 of Paul's epistles. The only one he doesn't cite explicitly is Philemon. Justin Martyr in AD 150 was already quoting many of the New Testament books, which indicates that the Gospels and many of the letters were already being credited with authority. Additionally, Papias was a friend of Polycarp and had heard the Apostle John preach. Such an early account from a friend of one of Jesus' inner circle disciples should provide enough evidence to affirm early canonicity of the New Testament. Kruger notes also at the end of the 2nd century, an anonymous anti-Montanist writer refers to the church's canonical books as the word of the new covenant of the gospel, erasing any doubts about whether the concepts of canon and covenant were closely linked in the minds of early Christians. Campenhausen notes that for Origen it seemed perfectly normal to use diatheke in the sense of book. Let's go further. The Egyptian theologian Origen, who lived from 184 to 253 AD, used this word, an obvious derivative, to refer to the books that he regarded as canonical. Tertullian, who lived from 155 AD to 220 AD, was an early apologist from Carthage, Tunisia, and North Africa. He cites at least 23 of the 27 New Testament books. At one point, Tertullian rejects the canonicity of the Shepherd and says it does not deserve a place in the Divino Instrumento, the divine canon, a clear reference to a new corpus of books. Thus, by the time of Clement of Alexandria, which was the middle of the 2nd century, the phrase New Covenant was fully established as the official title of the church's canon. Ferguson observes that for Clement, covenant meant or referred to written documents. Ignatius lived from 35 to 117 AD. Jim Warner Wallace writes, it's clear from Ignatius's letters that he knew many of the apostles as he mentioned them frequently and spoke of them as though many of his older readers also knew them. Scholars have pored over the letters written in AD 105 to 115 and have observed that Ignatius quoted or alluded to 7 to 16 New Testament books, including the Gospels of Matthew, John, and Luke, and several, if not all, of Paul's letters. One more example from antiquity. Wallace writes, in fact, Polycarp mentioned that the Philippians were well trained by the sacred scriptures and quoted Paul's letters to the Ephesians as an example of these scriptures. Polycarp quoted or referenced 14 to 16 New Testament books, including Matthew, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, 1 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1 Timothy, 1 Peter, and 1 John, with some scholars observing additional references to 2 Timothy and 2 Corinthians. How the canon came to be and when it came to be are therefore well established as having clear apostolic authorship, and that authorship occurred well before the first century was over. Now, finally, let me say a few words about translations and how they're created, because some have questioned the ability to know the original word as it was first transmitted due to the number of translations that exist. However, that's not an issue with the Bible as it is or might be with some other works of antiquity. The rule is you never make a translation from a translation. You always use the primary source document. Scholars refer back to an interlinear Bible, which is the original Hebrew and Greek, and translations are made from this, not from other translations. Generally speaking, the translations fall into one of three categories. First, there's formal equivalency. These versions prioritize preserving the form and structure of the original text over what is the most intelligible English, though of course they still want to be understood by readers. Here are some examples. Translations that are dynamically equivalent are at the other end of the spectrum, and we find versions that seek to prioritize clarity over grammar and syntax while still being true to the meaning of the text. Here are some examples of those. Finally, we have optimally equivalent translations. Now, these prioritize neither clarity over accuracy nor accuracy over clarity, but seek to attain as much of each as possible in every passage, recognizing that sometimes one may end up being favored slightly and sometimes another. Here's some examples of those. There's excellent support for recognizing the early authority of the New Testament authors and the New Testament documents they wrote. Additionally, the intrinsic model seems to account for more of the evidence than the extrinsic model, and should therefore be welcomed within serious academic circles. The biblical canon came legitimately, authoritatively, and was recognized consistently and early. And that canon is the starting point from which all other translations emerge. But I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments about how God orchestrated the design of the Bible, or maybe about one takeaway you got from this video. I hope it blessed you, but until next time, peace.